Hi! Are you angry yet? Because pretty much I assume no matter your political orientation, I'm about to make you. Angry, that is. Mad. Furious. I cannot make you. You are already made in ways that you had pretty much no control over. And part of the process of you having been made was your privilege or lack thereof. Which is the worst thing we're going to talk about today. Privilege, white privilege, male privilege, class privilege, which strangely enough is like very, very, very rarely talked about at all, even though it is the most important one of all of them by like 1,000 kilometers. I think they're ridiculous. They're right, don't get me wrong, but the nomenclature is just unfathomably stupid. What do you mean, Burger? The leftist political terminology that is so utterly unsuited for public discourse that it feels like they were almost deliberately chosen by a saboteur as a means of sabotaging actual leftist activism because it clothes all of it in a sort of impenetrable cant that spells the end of civilization when that's not really what it actually means. I am as shocked as you are. Nothing ever that I have witnessed could have prepared me for such an eventuality. But let's talk about what people mean when they say privilege, and then we're gonna talk about why that's a shit word. And why, quite frankly, I think to a certain extent it is on purpose that they're using that word, because of, you should be ashamed of yourselves being this cynical and childish. Right, so, okay, basic premise. Stick with me on this, right? Every person is born under a certain set of circumstances that they didn't decide on, and those circumstances then have an impact on the rest of their lives. Many people share very similar circumstances, but pretty much never, or at least extremely rarely, do we see exactly the same circumstances, because there's a lot of sliders here. People don't choose where they're born, what they look like, how able-bodied they are, how much wealth their parents and family at large have. They do not choose their biological sex, they do not choose their neurotype, they do not choose their sexual orientation, they do not choose their innate talents and abilities that they have an easier time with. They do not choose the ability of their parents to be good parents. And a million other things that are just utterly set in diamond, not just stone, for all eternity. This is how it is for these individual people forever, before they can even have a vague understanding of what these things even mean. Other things are chosen for them. They're not necessarily set in stone. They're massive, important things, but they are things that can be changed later in life. Their religion, their gender, their worldview, their education. However, it is often not simply a matter of, like, just saying that these things have changed and then they are changed. The things that were originally chosen for you will have an impact on you whether you later choose to change them or not. They will always be part of your past. They will always influence your way of thinking in ways so subtle you will barely be aware of it. And for many of them, changing them to be more in line with what you want can have unspeakable consequences that will just destroy your entire life. And all these circumstances that you didn't choose or that you can only in theory choose, facts about yourself, they intersect with each other in various different ways and create a complex interplay that will make certain aspects of your life easier and certain aspects of your life more difficult. That's why it's called intersectionality, by the way. It's because of how they all intersect in a way, and that's where the intersectionedness of it all. I'm really not trying to be condescending. I just realized this as I was writing the script for this video. I knew all of the things before, but then it's like, oh, this is what that name is from. And it really is an undeniable fact that some of the identities, some of the facts, the circumstances that you were born with are just going to be more advantageous than others. And conversely, obviously implied is that others are going to be more disadvantageous. You get boosts and you get hurdles. Because we're not in a role-playing game, a lot of people get a lot of boosts and even more people get a lot of hurdles. And it's only hurdles, very few boosts. Other people, a lot of boosts, almost no hurdles. Now here is something that a lot of people get wrong, and it pisses me off. Having a certain identity, which is, let's just call it identity, or the circumstances, the facts about, use the word identity. Having a certain identity does not mean that you automatically get all of the boosts and hurdles associated with that particular identity. It just means that you are more likely to be affected by those boosts and hurdles. Which, yes, does often amount to the same thing, but not always. Which specific boosts and hurdles you actually end up getting in practice, which of them become relevant to you, is often determined by your other identities and how they intersect with each other. So for instance, just because you're black does not mean that you are poor. Just because you are white does not mean you are rich. But being black correlates much more highly with being born into poverty than being born white. There are plenty of middle class and wealthy black families. There is a ton of impoverished white families. And people born into those families will just have different chances at life. In Baltimore, a very interesting thing happened where over the past couple of years, there was a significant boost in the grades that students had in like poor areas, specifically the kind of schools that a lot of poor kids go to. Academic success went up because, and this is true, they started giving out free eyeglasses to kids that needed them. These kids were from families that were so poor that they couldn't even afford their kids to get tested for visual impairment, much less, if they tested positive for visual impairment, afford the necessary corrective measures. And of course that's gonna impact your academic performance if you cannot fucking read. And once you know it, the majority of those kids were black. Even though the primary thing here is that they were poor. It's because being black correlates a lot with being poor for various complex historical reasons, racism, that we are going to talk about later. Having a family in which there's plenty of money to go around will just grant you more opportunities in your life. It isn't just that you have better starting capital and can focus on self-improvement exclusively, instead of having to spend time and energy doing shit you don't want to do and that really does nothing for you in order to be able to afford the barest necessities. Even if you moved to or were born into one of those beautiful countries where higher education is essentially free, it's not really free. You still have to pay rent, you still have to buy textbooks, which are often just ridiculously expensive. And if your parents can and do pay that for you, your life is just going to be easier. I don't feel like this is a very complicated thing to accept. And for many, especially in countries where higher education is not essentially free, this represents an utterly insurmountable hurdle that they cannot get over because it's just impossible for them to acquire the sort of money that's required for this. So they never get to enter higher education. There's also, the factor of things just happening in just bad things. They occur in your life, and there's nothing you could do to foresee this. You couldn't escape. It just happens sometimes. Shit just happens, and you have to fix it. Money helps with that. Navigating higher education can be rather difficult, much like many other fields. Having family members that went through that process because your family had a measure of wealth, it makes it easier. You can ask them for advice, you can ask them for help, which is going to give you a huge boost. To be successful in any field, you need to know people. Being good at a thing alone just will not cut it. If you come from a wealthy family, that family is much more likely to have the sort of contacts you need in order to become successful. Even if you're legitimately fucked up, right? Which is something that happens. You made a mistake. Every human being that has lived for any reasonable length of time has made mistakes. It's normal and human to make mistakes. Coming from a wealthy background means you are much more insulated against the fallout of those mistakes. And in many places, when it comes to the legal system, your wealth takes another step back, and the main important thing becomes your skin color and your gender. If I were someone who sold a little bit of drugs on the side to pay for my university education, I would much rather be a white girl than a black man. If you're not white, and more importantly, if you're not wealthy, you can just make fewer mistakes in life. That is the place where the privilege lives. And as anyone who has ever mastered anything will tell you, making a fuck ton of mistakes is how you become good at things. And so if you can make more mistakes without seeing the game over screen, naturally, that's an advantage. If you're not privileged, you need to work much harder to get the exact same results. This is why, you know how you know people who come from like marginalized minority groups and they have an incredible work ethic and oh, they're so disciplined and so good at what they do. It isn't that being poor, growing up marginalized, fosters those qualities. I'm sure it plays some minute level of a role, but it's really incidental. It's that among marginalized minorities, those lucky enough to be born with the innate qualities that allowed them to develop an insane work ethic and discipline are the only ones who have even a vague chance at making it. And they didn't choose to be born with those faculties either. Which, yes, does mean that depending on how many identities intersect in which ways, and let me tell you, there's a lot of possible combination here. So keeping things as they are is not going to foster more discipline in minorities that will help them rise to the top. It'll just keeping the ones that are not lucky down. Because if you have the privilege of being born wealthy, you don't have to work all that hard to make it. You may find yourself in a position where it does not matter how hard you work in life, you can never, ever make it out of the abject poverty you exist in. And you just factually cannot work infinitely hard to get yourself out of the darkest of circumstances. That just isn't how reality works. Think of some like African kid that lives in a village at the border of the savannah where they don't even have like running water or electricity because they've been historically deprived of the fruits of their own labor. And also, it's like hot as shit there. Super smart kid, could be a world-class neurosurgeon. Never even going to have anything close to the resources needed to get into any sort of medical field. And if you are sitting there right now, as I'm sure some of you are, thinking, no, it's all about hard work. We all start on a level playing field. You just need to work hard and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I recommend growing the fuck up. I'm not gonna belabor this point with you. If really you can listen to what I have to say, you can evaluate it for yourself, and if you still end up thinking that all is just and fine with the world, I'm not gonna be the one to change your mind. I don't care how many rags to riches, propaganda, and hope stories you have seen in Hollywood movies. That is just incongruent with reality. That isn't how that works. That's just like people looking for their, Disney prince or their manic pixie dream girl. It's not a thing. It doesn't happen in the real world. And you're gonna have to stop being a child about it. I'm sure you had your own challenges to conquer. Those challenges are valid. I'm sure it took a lot out of you, and I'm happy that you managed to do it. Maybe there are still challenges that you need to conquer. Those are real, and they matter too. This also doesn't diminish all the hard work I am sure you put in to be wherever you are in life right now. But would it kill you to acknowledge that other people exist in different circumstances than you and have different problems to deal with than you do? Hard work is very useful when pursuing success, but you can work hard and still you will need a huge dose of luck. Or you can just be lucky and not work hard. And this discrepancy in what kind of boosts and what kind of hurdles people who are part of certain groups in society get is what intersectionalists call privilege. A lot of these things, they don't even require people to hold racist beliefs in society right now. We could be living in a perfect utopia in that regard where no one even thinks of any I didn't even realize you were black. The circumstances of your birth, essentially, the past racism that has already happened and that has not unhappened, through the form of class and wealth and intergenerational poverty, have already set the stage for you. Are you trying to apply for a loan to start a business? Well, tough shit, cause you're poor and your family doesn't have money. No one can offer up any collateral, and because you had to buy groceries for your siblings growing up, your credit is fucked. Try again next life. People do still hold racist beliefs though, by the way. I'm just to point this out, it's an irritatingly high number too. But if you're not of the group that they are racist against, you might go through your entire life never knowing that they're racist. It doesn't really modify how they interact with you, it modifies how they interact with minorities. Or you can also see it in the way that it does modify how they interact with you and how they interact with minorities. I don't really think that any of these two options are more true. Many years ago, I had a friend, good friend, very cool, chill dude, whom I really liked. And I, at some point, had a conversation with a bunch of girls I grew up with, and they talked about, like, a bunch of fucked up shit. He did, like, very creepy, like, sexual assaulty type things. And I was dumbfounded, because to me, this had always just been this cool, loyal guy. He had helped me out of troublesome situations. But that was because I was not a woman. I had never seen that side of that particular guy. This happens all the time. It's normal. You don't know everything about everyone that you know. And you shouldn't be expected to either. And I think that a lot of white people especially will just pretend that racism, or at least racist opinions, don't exist anymore because they don't like racism. They just don't like it. Just conceptually, it makes them extremely uncomfortable to think about this. And so because they have the luxury not to think about this and, like, slather themselves in feeling terrible about something that they had no hand in creating, they just pretend it's not happening. I think this really is the reason why a lot of them, like, unconsciously decide to go, yeah, the rights are equal, therefore we good. And I really don't think this comes from a bad place. It comes from a very good place, actually. It's like a place of sort of misguided idealism. I have a lot of sympathy for that. I am immensely frustrated, you know, being someone whose soul essentially came from Star Trek Future, that I had to learn about all this racism shit. I arrive here, the world is like this, what the fuck? You know, they can, like, afford to see the world as better than it actually is, which is also as kind of a privilege. The inverse also happens, and it is something that a lot of people love to forget, and a lot of other people love to hyperfixate on too much. People with marginalized identities mistreat people with less marginalized identities in horrible ways all the time. And then they use that discrepancy and privilege to, like, justify their heinous actions. And it matters when that happens. They are being assholes when that happens. You were not wrong about that. It just happens a whole less frequently than the other way around, which does not justify that happening. It's just a less frequent constellation. The marginalized individual in question is less likely to have some sort of systemic power over you. You know, also, conversely, white people do not automatically hold some sort of systemic power over every single non-white person. It's just an observation of the likelihoods. And this, as a sort of bit of an aside, this is why a lot of people, intersectionalists and critical race scholars, especially from among them, say that this is why black people cannot be racist to white people. I think that's a pretty stupid take, but the main thing that really pisses me off about it is that a lot of people just use it as an excuse to be assholes. At least I always hope that they do it because they don't understand it and want to be assholes. Because otherwise it would mean they know exactly what it means, that it doesn't really mean that, and that they're just lying so they can be assholes, which would make them worse people, arguably. It's ultimately like a semantical trick. It redefines the word racism as being like not just prejudice, but prejudice plus power. So if you have prejudiced views and also the power to make things happen based upon those views, then that's actually racism. Which isn't what the word has meant and does mean for like 99% of the people who use it. Except, and this is rather crucial, it's applied to groups, not individual people. Except, of course, when some people do apply it to individual people as a justification to be a dick. So as a group, there's a lot of merit in that statement, because you cannot deny the fact that as a group, like white people, worldwide Western people, just have a lot more power and have historically had a lot more power than black people. And they have used that power to oppress those black people. So the theory says because of that, and you know, this is still the case to a huge extent, just not as much as it used to be, black people do not have the power to make the prejudice that they absolutely can have into like a terrible systemic consequence. Now here's the problem I do have with this, you know, rather true thesis. And this is like aside from the fact that like a bunch of academics decided to just take a word and redefine it to be in line with their own worldview and then pretend it like it is the only valid possible definition, and that everyone who uses it must use their particular definition of the word, which is an incredibly American thing to do. And that's not prejudice because I judged it after the fact. Groups don't really interact with each other. They are categories, demographics. They're not magical egregore hive minds doing battle in the upper layers of the Umbra. The only interactions that occur are between individuals. And if you are, say, a black business owner who doesn't give a white person a job solely on the basis that they are white, and also where that makes sense, of course, I mean, that, like, I don't want Ryan Reynolds to have the same chances of playing Nelson Mandela as, say, Morgan Freeman. That would be, I mean, it would be kind of funny, much like if you had like a Napoleon Bonaparte, right? But he's played by Idris Elba, and he does, like, he wears the uniform and all that, and he's like taller than everyone else, right? They like make him seem taller, and then he still has like be small man syndrome, which isn't even something that the historical Napoleon had. And he speaks with like the full London accent, like he's basically playing Luther. That would be really funny. But we're getting massively sidetracked here. You know what I mean. Here we have someone with systemic power over another person who creates a negative consequence for that person based on prejudice. And a lot of critical race scholars would actually say, yeah, that meets the definition of racism, even if the boss was black and the employee not to be was white. Other people would say, no, that doesn't matter. The skin color is much more important than the actual real power of class. And those people are wrong. It's certainly like consistent with their worldview, because their worldview exists in order to justify them being assholes to other people, to just be racist in a socially acceptable way. But that is usually how you identify a hypocrite, is the same thing happens and they judge it differently. Because while we are debating in our ivory towers about whether or not the thing that just happened was racism, which I need to just point out that, like, probably most critical race scholars would say, yeah, that is racism. Something terrible just happened. And we're not doing anything about that, which is really what bothers me about this. It reeks of hyper-intellectualized racial vengeance. It has a pretense of academic analysis when it's really just like wanting to feel self-righteous about being heinous and vindictive to people who never did anything to you. But you know, their ancestors did your ancestors dirty. When that is even the case, like, let's be serious, most of the time it's just someone taking up the mantle of fighting for a group of people who never asked that person to fight for them. White people didn't choose to be born white, and the ones that are alive today also didn't choose that there was racism in the past. That's just not how reality works. It also, on like a metaphysical level, turns minorities into like groups of just tools that are there to help with white people's post-religious spiritual salvation, which happens through guilt. If, in case you weren't aware, white people love guilt. We invented a whole Catholicism about it. And aside from that, they like become a poker chip to be used by some white people to just be assholes to other white people. And that, I think that's kind of fucked up. It denies their fundamental ability to be moral agents in their own right. It's dehumanizing, and geo golly, I know this is controversial, but I am just not a big fan of when human beings are dehumanized. I don't like it. Not to mention, this sort of ethnic vengeance type narrative has been the reason behind like 90% of all horrible wars and genocides, atrocities committed in human history, which no, did not in fact start in the Renaissance and has not in fact ended. Although, for my numbers to be correct, I reckon you need to include like all the bullshit anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have existed over the years. If you are someone who seeks historic vengeance against people who look a certain way, even if those people look the same as you are a bad person. It's really that simple. Because seeking self-righteous justification for cruelty is a thing that a bad person does. Taking your resentment out on people who share superficial characteristics with people who did you dirty is something a bad person does. This is literally the driving force of racism. Like, the traditional white racist does this all the time. And I think we can all agree that that person is a bad person. And if you feel like you can identify with any constellation of that, please seek help. I am afraid that you are terribly misled in life, and I do believe that you can become a better person. Doesn't mean you will, but I think you can. In some aspects of intersectionality, we have definitive advantages to a person's life being framed as primarily a form of lack of privilege. You know the classic, women have always been the primary victims of war? An absurd statement from the point of view of everyone who, died in the war. They're killed, they no longer exist, they have ceased to be entirely. Or, those traumatized by that kind of thing happening around them all the time. Watching their friends die, being forced to murder other people, because it turns out, and this is true, humans don't like murdering other human beings, even if they're complete strangers. They're not very fond of that. There is a degree of internal consistency here. This isn't just plucked out of the void. Women are seen as too weak to go to war, which is, of course, a ridiculous way of viewing women. Like, yeah, sure, maybe biology has made it so on average, men are better at going to war than women, but especially when it comes to people who are physically formidable, that is actually not particularly pronounced. There's always been plenty of women who would have been better as soldiers than plenty of men who did get sent to be soldiers. The reason women were kept back is because patriarchs needed them as breeding machines. But you cannot possibly be allowed to call not having to go to distant places in grueling marches that probably will see you die of starvation or just lose your feet to some sort of weird fucking disease that might just be overuse. So you can't call that a form of privilege, because they still had to be women. Ontologically, they're just part of a group that isn't privileged, and therefore that isn't privilege. Rendering intersectional analysis completely pointless as a tool to do analysis with. If you already know the results of the analysis before you start the analysis, you might as well not do the analysis. This line of thinking really reeks to me of the type of artificially constructed, warped worldview that narcissists, specifically abusive narcissists that then impose that on other people, create to sort of always win out in every conversation, to always be the center of attention, to always be the most important person and the biggest victim at the end of the day. It's a way of saying, yeah, you may be dead, but have you considered how much of an insult that is to me? It's one of those things that, most people who call themselves feminists don't believe because they understand it to be absurd. But it is right there in a lot of feminist ideology. Most commonly, this is just my own subjective experience in talking about this to a lot of people. Just way too many people. It's often, it acknowledges that not dying is kind of a favorable outcome, more favorable than dying. But it still goes out of its way to recategorize this type of suffering as lesser than the other suffering, even though it will just claim to not be doing that. If you weren't recategorizing the suffering, you wouldn't have to recategorize the suffering. And I do wonder why so many people ultimately end up talking the talk, and I may be walking the walk. I've not really seen enough of that to confirm or deny it, of this being such an important belief in their lives. Especially because it ultimately just reinforces so much about the patriarchal gender norms and expectations regarding men, their disposability, and them being tools for what patriarchs are trying to achieve. And come to think of it, I cannot, and again, this is my personal experience, not summon a single example of where that general type of philosophical through line hasn't been used to just exercise petty authority in an interpersonal relationship. To get one over on someone, to minimize their suffering. So if this is a very cherished belief of yours, I think maybe you should re-examine if the reason that this is a very cherished belief of yours is that you're a bit of a cunt, and not in a good way. But that's just me being not very fond of the patriarchy. You might have other opinions on that. Which really brings up my gripe with the word privilege as such. And to do that, I'm gonna have to bring this down to like a very personal level. I'm white, you may have heard this on the radio, and I'm not just like European, but German, which is a fantastic place to be born into absolute poverty. Now, my poverty isn't so much an effect of my family being poor, although they are certainly more working class than anything else, and more of the fact that like various people I am descended of find my existence sort of like inconvenient to their existence. I won't bore you with the details, but ultimately when you tally it all up, my parents did the bare minimum of what they legally had to, and usually not even that. During my childhood, I was either like a token to be owned, so some people could hurt other people by showing off the fact that they owned me, and then when that was no longer like a present conflict within the family dynamic, I was discarded. So I don't really have a family or anything related to the support system that includes, which as actually I encounter a lot of the time situations where that is like expected. Society and the system expects you to have a family to rely on. And if you don't have that, you can run into some serious issues. Except for my grandma, shout out to my grandma, I couldn't have done it without her. I grew up mostly in what Americans might affectionately call the system, although not in like a foster home type situation, but in like a children's home. And within that context, I was lucky enough to be placed in a very good children's home, as far as that is possible at all. But you wouldn't be able to tell pretty much any of this by looking at me or hearing me talk, especially if you only hear me speak English. This was a very deliberate decision that I made to sort of dissociate myself from the scene that I grew up in, for the ultimate goal of like being taken seriously in higher education. Because how I grew up, I did not have much control over, but how I present myself, I do. I was put in like the lowest tier of schooling because when I came to Germany, my German was sort of, you know, meh. My maths was always horrible. I have a disability. My English was excellent for reasons that I don't quite understand still, because I had been going to school in Spain. And, I mean, if you are from Spain, you know that, like, the quality of English teacher that usually runs around there. So basically, I was educationally disadvantaged at a crucial time in my life because I had, like, a foreign and a working class background, which people love to deny to this day. The clothes that I wear are, like, in-group signifiers that are not that kind of in-group. I developed the type of clothes that I wear, or that I used to wear. I've since upgraded my style to include more self-expression. But originally there was almost no self-expression in it. It was just a way for me to like hide behind a mask, which is something I had to do to be like taken seriously to anyone who went to school after grade 10. And that wasn't super difficult for me because, you know, I am white. Now granted, I do get asked like, oh, where are you from? Quite often, and like sometimes when I go to the kebab shop guy wants to converse with me in Turkish. Beautiful language, I just don't speak it. But I do think it has something to do with, I mean, I know that it has something to do with my accent. But I will be seen as an other with much less frequency than someone who is like black, Asian, very obviously Middle Eastern. And even when people do see me as foreign, they're much more likely to see me as like the clean, interesting type of foreign instead of like the dirty, suspect kind of foreign. So I'll always be more German than like someone who isn't white but is German as beer. Which I am not, by the way. I grew up in Spain, as I said, for a lot of years during my childhood. I find a lot of German culture very unrelatable. Because, you know, again, while racism is certainly fairly frowned upon in society these days, people don't really think very highly of it. The more brown your skin is, the more of it is revealed to you. It is like the gift curse of an ancient deity that reveals to you how likely any given person is to call you the N-word. Another discrepancy in being treated how I am is because I am and do read as a guy, a fella, a masculine man. I actually do think the word guy is a bit gender neutral, but that's not part. You know what the fuck I'm talking about. I've been noticing this especially as I've grown older. Young men are treated like complete trash by society, and this is just a fact. Like, let's stop gaslighting young men who are experiencing this every single day about the fact that their lives and their personalities are considered to be just trash. One really, funny example, this is an anecdote I almost like telling, is I was fairly new at the town I lived in, and I do still live in now. I was 21 years old. I was eating a sausage at a sausage food making establishment. And I was just sitting there. I was just having lunch. And the guy who was the owner of this establishment, he comes up to me and he asks me about some sort of local cultural festival that I'd never heard about, not being from here. And I was like, I've never heard about this, not being from here. And he called me a stupid boy, a fucking idiot. How could I not know about this? Motherfucker, I just spent a lot of money on your overpriced and frankly quite mid sausage. I'm not one of those customers always right type of people, but I would very much appreciate if you didn't call me a cunt. But as I have grown, I have found that a lot of the default attitudes to me have become much more respectful, especially by the types of people who would have belittled me in the past. I'm 28 now. I am young but old enough. I am officially an adult male. People take me seriously. And unfortunately, I can't say that I have also observed this development with most of the women my age. I mean, I'm sure it's better than it used to be, It used to be pretty fucking bad, but I see when women who have just the same amount of life experience I do are having a conversation with someone that would have a perfectly respectful eye-level conversation with me, but will not have that same type of conversation with them. Now, in fairness, I am also treated differently in very negative ways because I'm a man, and I have a whole video on this. I'm putting it up here so you can see it. But overall, I'd say bottom line, it's more positive than negative. And it's a positive experience a lot of other people don't have because they are not men. I didn't choose this, but I think it kinda fucking sucks. My only issue is with calling it privilege. Because being treated with basic human respect, not being treated like a dangerous outsider because of your ethnicity, having the same opportunities as a rich person even though you were born poor, those are not privileges. That's what we call rights. Look, I am aware that the word privilege has a very specific meaning in a very particular analytical framework. It's just that it means something completely different outside of that framework. In the real world where most of the people who talk about things are, in political discourse, legally speaking, you know how dictionaries have example sentences that with every term so you can see how that term is used in a sentence? Pretty much every dictionary in the English language has the sentence, a privilege, not a right, as that sentence for the word privilege. 99.9% of the English-speaking population on this planet understands the word privilege as something that is not a given and can and sometimes should be taken away. Something that is earned, something that is not guaranteed to everyone. Do you see now why perhaps maybe right-wing propaganda groups whose job it is to maliciously interpret intersectional and critical theory type political discourse and spread that as political propaganda among regular people to turn as many of them reactionary as is humanly possible? You see how they have a very easy time explaining to those people that what progressives are trying to do is take away their basic rights? You are, after all, saying the sentence, I want to take away your basic rights. It doesn't really matter if what you mean has no relation to what the words of this sentence actually add up to. That is what you are saying, and you cannot reasonably be mad at people for understanding the thing you are literally saying. Do you recognize how that under some circumstances might lead to a tiny bit of a miscommunication? Privilege does not buy you anything. Not being privileged costs you something that you should have. Insisting on the word privilege creates a zero-sum game where there shouldn't be one, because there isn't one. The issues non-privileged, underprivileged people face, those are special, if not in practice certainly, then definitely in the kind of world that we should strive to build. Because a vision of something to build is something people can actually get behind. There is a discrepancy in how they are treated, what they experience, and how it is their right to be treated, and what is their right to experience. And the word privilege outside of your ivory tower, it doesn't mean that, and it shouldn't mean that. Because you don't get to define how every single person talks. You do not own the concept of language. All the word privilege does is very strongly imply that white people should be oppressed. That's all it implies. Especially when you claim that it doesn't. They will just feel deceived. Because, and this is true, most people do not have the time to be academics. They need to work as plumbers. They have their own lingo. You're not expected to understand their lingo. Why would you expect them to understand yours? So like many people, I really question why so many folks are so very insistent that this is what the word must be. That there is no possible alternative. No other way of describing this. Especially given that it is such an inaccurate term to describe what's happening, and so counterproductive in stopping what's happening. It just needlessly antagonizes a huge group of people that are, like, according to the theory itself, very powerful, or at least it makes them much more easy to manipulate by the interests that actually run society, aka the rich. But far be it from me to psychoanalyze the whole diverse cadre of what is academics. And really, who gives a shit what they call things? Who cares? What matters is that we see the problems and we do something on a systemic level to fix them. To right the injustices that many of our fellow human beings face. I don't want to be just as counterproductive in the goal of creating a more equal society. I just think that social engineering runs into a hard wall when it tries to prescribe people's worldview instead of engaging with their beliefs in a good faith manner. The moment you try to force people to believe something under threat of shame, social exclusion, and whatever the fuck, you will start meeting resistance. And I think the fact that we pretty much push exclusively in this avenue with the massive amounts of activist power that we do otherwise have is harming progress. Especially if you insist on using words that describe the people you are trying to convince of your point of view as ontologically villainous, based on aspects of their identity that they had no control over. What we can do something about, what much more energy needs to be put into, is changing the socio-economic circumstances that create most of these problems. Which I think is not as much of a priority for people who go to and work at universities, because those people are born into upper and middle class environments. What we need to do is tear down the hurdles that people would face even if there wasn't a single sexist or racist belief in our society. And the simplest way of doing that is by boosting them. So here comes the part where I advocate for reparations. I believe black people in America, and really all marginalized groups in all of the colonized nations around the world, deserve reparations for what was done to their ancestors because they still live with the consequences of that today. It's not just that they were kidnapped, oppressed, and had their cultures eroded. That's terrible, but you can't really do anything to make that unhappen. It's that their labor was stolen. And you can definitely still do something about that. In the case of African Americans, probably by the worst instance of slavery happening ever. Cultures and practices of slavery have existed and occurred many times throughout human history. Read a history book, it's almost like D&D lore. But because of the sheer size and cruelty of it, I think you can probably say that the transatlantic slave trade is the worst instance of that happening. And the competition is very steep, considering how, like, the Romans treated the Germanic peoples and all the others that they enslaved. Socioeconomically, you had these people working brutal jobs for essentially no compensation. The fruits of their labor went entirely into the pockets of their owners. The money they made, the money they contributed to the economy, did not go to their descendants. Instead of becoming intergenerational wealth, they became intergenerational poverty. Because as we've already established, if you were born into poverty, it's extremely difficult to get out of it if you have a lot of hurdles placed in your way, which is what poverty inherently is. Especially if that was followed up by like a century or more of policies specifically designed to keep you second-class citizens. During segregation, black people were deprived of access to infrastructure, education, and like even just good land to live on. Real estate is one of the primary mechanisms through which wealth is passed along the generations. And this is still happening today. Redlining may no longer be officially a thing, but real estate agents pretty much anywhere in the United States are still going to show you very different houses if you have the wrong skin tone. And if you find all this a bit weird because, you know, maybe you're not black, imagine for a moment, like pretend that your ancestors had been like enslaved by powerful people in the past, forced to work for nothing or next to nothing. And then because of that, their descendants, your other more recent ancestors, only ever had really terrible jobs that paid next to nothing, no matter how hard they worked, because they were systemically deprived of every other opportunity. And now you're poor because of that. Your neighborhood looks like shit because of that. Your family has no money because of that. Wouldn't you want that rectified somehow if you were in that situation? Okay, sure, yes, but like how? How do we do that? Do we just give all black people $1,000? What if you're half black? Maybe quarter black? A lot of people are descendants of both slaves and slave owners. Do we give it out by family? Do we then give bigger families more money? Would that even be fair? What about mixed race families? Do we give this money to black millionaires and billionaires? Do we give more of it to poorer black people? Do we make that dependent on like the local income or the national income? What about black immigrants who came to the United States like after slavery ended? Often from places that were colonized by other Western powers, so the exploitation of their ancestors' labor didn't go to the US economy. A lot of those might be actually quite rich and descendants of the people who used to sell the slaves to the white slave traders. The answer is, of course, none of that, really. It wouldn't achieve too much. It would be wildly impossible to administrate. Not to mention completely politically unfeasible. This is a systemic problem, and we require systemic solutions for it. Sure, cash payments to minorities, they would accomplish like something. They wouldn't be useless, but quite frankly, they are unpopular even with the minorities in question. What people are really looking for is large-scale investment and the revitalization of low-income neighborhoods. And there's actually a lot of options for this, because the thing that makes low-income areas is usually that they are deprived of access to infrastructure. And they can happen in cities, or they can happen far out in the country. You will have roads that are just in a terrible state of repair. Water, gas, electricity that are like unreliable in their supply and ultimately cost more. Slow or otherwise unreliable internet or other telecommunications technology, it should be pretty obvious why you need that to like work, to find work, engage with your work, get into higher education, work higher education. Not even higher education. You can't go to fucking school anymore if you don't have an internet connection. Access to public transport because, you know, it'll help you get to your job. Or the supermarket where there's actually affordable food for you. Cars are unspeakably expensive to maintain. This one is so important that you have there's a significant difference in the average income of streets that do have a bus stop versus neighboring streets that do not, which obviously doesn't mean that every street needs its own bus stop. Public green spaces and curbside greenery. This may seem minor and purely aesthetic, but the plant life, the flora of an urban area has a huge impact on the local climate. If you go to low-income areas, you will see it's basically all just concrete. Maybe there's a patch of grass here, a tree over there, that's it. No colonnades of venerable oaks lining the roads. Instead of a park with a pond, you have a basketball court. And a basketball court, and then another basketball court. Because, and this is true, a slab of concrete costs a lot less to maintain than a tree. The result is not just hideous neighborhoods, but also a significantly increased temperature, which makes life harder in almost every respect. From causing AC to be just more expensive because you need to run it harder, to increased risk of dehydration, especially if you work in hard, physically demanding jobs. Access to financial service needs to be improved drastically. Usually, people in these neighborhoods, and this plays actually rather deeply into the whole public transport thing, they only have access to predatory loan sharks or huge banks, which are predatory loan sharks in tailored business suits. They may offer you decent rates, but the machines in those neighborhoods do not offer good rates. Creating the infrastructure and readying the resources required to help those areas build their own credit unions might be a huge boon to that. This way, communities can form their own banks and federations of banks and keep the wealth that they have to reinvest it into their own economy. If you want to find out more about credit unions and why they are a better option for you to put your money in as well, check out my video on that. Access to education is essential. They need good schools with good teachers. They need labs that are actually stocked with things that you use in a lab. Schools are running out of pens, for fuck's sake. They are understaffed, underfunded, and have no idea how to deal with the special requirements of impoverished students. And having metal detectors, by the way, is not how you deal with those special requirements. Access to community centers, places where neighborhood organized workshops can be held and meetings can be done. You can host a bunch of activities for at-risk youth there, so you can create other options and other perspectives for them that are not just living life as a gangster. This is something that gangsters want also. They don't want their kids to have to lead the same shitty lives they did. Speaking of that, sweeping criminal justice reform, especially if we're talking about the United States, because the way especially the prison industrial complex works right now, they're just locking tens of thousands of young black men into a cycle, an inescapable cycle of having to be a criminal with no chance of rehabilitation. They get much harsher sentences for the same crimes than white people do, and then they can't get out of that because the prisons, of course, don't want them to ever fully be away from prison. The prisons make money off of those guys being there. Your money, by the way. That's your taxpayer money that's going to the prisons. And they are deliberately making sure that the people that leave their prisons are coming back soon enough. You could do small business grants for people living in the area. Grants to improve housing in those areas. Construction of new housing made affordable to local residents. And which is then not just handed over to investors, which will then just jack up prices, kick people out, or abandon the projects altogether, which is what has usually been happening. This is actually a very, very crucial factor, right? We want to revitalize these neighborhoods and towns. We do not want to gentrify them. If you need a refresher on what gentrification is, it's when basically rich people see an opportunity to turn a place where land is comparatively cheap for their standards into something that they want to be using. So they will start moving into these low-income areas. You will have real estate companies twisting the arm of local residents, forcing them out of their homes with every underhanded and shady tactic you can imagine. As local businesses get replaced with Starbucks, it slowly prices out the people who have lived there for a long time because they can no longer afford the suddenly jacked up rent and also the taxes, the overall cost of living, and the only option they then really have is to sell the land to some massive corporation for very little money, only so that corporation can then resell it for a lot of money because they have the monopoly on owning property in that area. Brooklyn and San Francisco are very famous areas where this happened to, especially like their minority communities used to be marginalized places, and like they were gentrified to death. San Francisco and Los Angeles themselves have become so utterly gentrified that even a lot of the people who do live and work there, sometimes in the very lucrative industries that gentrified the areas in the first place, cannot afford to live there. Like, have you ever seen one of those videos where there's like a homeless person tent that has a television in it and a computer and a good AC unit? That is someone's home who is working full time and still cannot afford rent where his place of work is. The small town in Spain where I spent most of my childhood in has been almost entirely gentrified into becoming like Airbnbs and luxury vacation homes for very, very rich people. There are many options to combat gentrification and to make sure that the measures you employ are actually revitalizing. The main one being strengthening the rights of tenants. There must be strict limits on how much rent can be increased within a certain given time period. In many places, these sort of rent controls are non-existent or are essentially non-existent, with landlords often suddenly jacking up prices, doubling or tripling them without warning. Imagine if the biggest expense you have suddenly tripled. Leases should renew automatically, right? No more the landlord thinks they can get a new richer person in, they just renew, and there's a very limited set of circumstances under which landlords can terminate and kick you out. Landlords that just have empty apartments sitting around should be fined, as opposed to what's happening now, which is in many places they can just write those off their taxes. Which essentially means that you, dear taxpayer, are subsidizing landlords' refusal to operate within the margins of the rules of the market, of supply and demand. They artificially increase prices and refuse to rent out to rates which people are actually willing to pay. Right now in New York, for instance, you have whole neighborhoods where most of the flats and most of the apartment buildings are just empty. A big problem with like business investment in general, especially after the massive deregulations of neoliberalism in the 70s, that big businesses are just going to go into a place, acquire something that is vital for people there to have, restrict access to it, not produce any more of it, often even destroy some of the supply. Product destructions are very common to artificially jack up prices just so they can extract a profit from this thing that was just available before. Why do you think they want to privatize like drinking water? That's a huge project for a lot of corporations. It wouldn't be supplying more of it. They can't really supply more of it. They just want to extract profit from it. Short-term rentals like Airbnbs must be taxed more highly or outlawed entirely in areas that are not specifically there for tourists to hang out. And of course, funding needs to be made available to help people build housing cooperatives, which provide good, quality, affordable housing to their members. Measures like this are common across many parts of Europe and other parts of the world, and they are very, very effective. Even in cities with limited rent controls, but where those rent controls are not so limited that they have essentially no effect, and where there's only like a small housing cooperative that develops some of the real estate, there's a knock-on effect on the rent prices, which are usually significantly lower than comparative cities. And housing quality is not only often not impacted at all, but frequently is even better than in places that do not have these measures in place. If you want to learn more about housing co-ops, I have a video on them as well. Some forms of reparation are in fact already happening, like the famous affirmative action scholarships and other affirmative action measures. Many things, they're not defined explicitly as reparations, like having a strong and stable social safety net. The idea with the scholarship specifically is obviously to compensate for some of the hurdles that marginalized students had that non-marginalized marginalized students didn't. And ideally you do this by creating additional capacities in higher education, which is obviously not always what happens because a lot of these places are also businesses that are trying to extract profit. We're gonna talk about that a little more soon enough. And believe it or not, anyone who isn't like a minority is going to benefit from this. This isn't even the part of the video where I argue for white people to get reparations as well. The goal of all this should be to elevate marginalized ethnicities to a level that they should have been at had their ancestors' labor not been stolen from them. When more people have access to wealth and education, you have more people who can buy things and more people who can innovate, both of which are things that I'm sure you can agree will be good for you as well when someone buys things from your business or when someone creates a product that you really want. Not to mention you'd be removing negative effects like crime and political instability. We know for a fact, this isn't like just a theory, we know this factually to be true, that poverty is what causes crime. That's the one thing that causes it. People who are poor are more likely to become criminals. One of the main reasons for that being that when you grow up poor because of all the hurdles that exist in your life, that's the only way for a lot of people that they can see to make any sort of meaningful money. There's many other factors to this too as well, and I have mentioned some of them previously. So of course, if you have a demographic that is disproportionately poor, they are going to be disproportionately criminal. Even if the overwhelming majority of them never even crossed a red light. Criminals are always a tiny slice to any given population. Some people might feel apprehensive about this, so imagine for a moment if you lived in an entirely homogenous country where everyone had your ethnicity. Would you not want what is best for, the economy of your country, yourself, the people that share your ethnicity, by like lifting them out of poverty, especially given that it would only have positive effects on you specifically? If the answer in that scenario is yes, but the answer to the same scenario, if that is like a different ethnicity that's not your own ethnicity, is no, then congratulations, you are racist. However, and this is a crucial caveat, right? I do not think if we were to do reparations in the way that society is currently structured, it would be just. Because the people who would be fitting the bill for those reparations would most certainly not be the people who actually benefited primarily from that exploitation, aka the rich. This is how the tax burden is distributed. Middle-class people would be paying for this. And yes, sure, you can make some sort of causal argument that they too benefited from slavery to a certain extent. It's true, there is a causal link in anything that reaches far enough back. You could make a similar argument for low-income black people when you compare them to the aforementioned African villager in the middle of nowhere. The transatlantic slave trade is an enormous hyper-object. It affected a lot of strands of fate. But the fact is, owning slaves was not, in any iteration of slavery, a middle-class endeavor. Even in the heyday of slavery, the only people who really owned slaves were the ultra-rich. What in today's political jargon we would call the 1%. And here's a fucked up little factoid too. A lot of places where slavery was ended, for instance, the UK, slave owners were the ones who got the reparations. They were paid exorbitant sums to be like, oh, pretty please, stop owning people that do work for you, that you oppress. And the people whose labor was actually stolen walked away with nothing, and if they were extremely lucky, an obulus that was symbolic more than anything else. That cash infusion into the pockets of the wealthy carried through the generations as well. If you agree with the premise that reparations should be paid on the basis of socioeconomics, you should also agree that the people who should be shouldering that burden would be the ones who, now that all this time has passed, have benefited the most from the consequences of that exploitation. Even the exploitation that happens today in modern colonialism, other eras of colonialism, and that's very rich people. There's overseas companies extracting wealth from Africa in the form of minerals and labor too. That money isn't going into the pockets of regular French people. It goes into the pockets of the wealthiest of the wealthy, where it will do very little for the economy, by the way. So in order to make reparations happen, we'll need to tax the rich. And we'll need to tax them a lot. The middle class, for the most part, they're already paying their fair share. The poor are paying too much. Also, and this is the part I reckon a lot of people have been waiting for, if you buy into the premise that reparations should happen based on the labor that was stolen from your ancestors, white people deserve reparations too. Yeah, you heard that right. Almost half of the Europeans that moved to what was back then known as the colonies, like pre-America days, came over the Atlantic Ocean as part of a scheme called indenture. Basically what would happen is that rich landowners in the colonies would sort of like get the people over here, pay for their cost of relocation, and have them sign a contract that they would have to work a certain amount of time for free to like pay off the debt that they had incurred. Of course, the debt that they incurred was like pretty much never even remotely proportional to the actual cost of relocation. Many indentured servants, often they found themselves in situations where their owners, they're no longer owners, kept working them. Because like, what were they gonna do? Sure, your contract is expired, but are you gonna go out into the forest? The guy who had your contract still has the document, could easily fake some numbers on it. The motherfucker has guns and dogs and essential immunity from legal prosecution. They're skinwalkers in the forest. Not to mention, a lot of the indentured servants, they didn't want to go to America. They had groups of like mercenaries essentially running around the European countryside, just kidnapping poor people and then shipping them over to the United States, where they were then indentured. Does that sound like any other deeply cruel and inhumane institution that you have known of from the history books? And during colonial times, it wasn't like the average European like benefited from the exploitation of people of color overseas either. They just got like the proverbial gun put to their head economically and forced to become the boot by which the rich people pushed down on the marginalized minorities and to remain like cheap peasant labor back home where it was needed. That money, that development, all went into the pockets of rich people as well. It was only through the advent of organized labor that like white people, Europeans that weren't ultra rich across the generations reclaimed even a fraction of the wealth that was stolen from them over the centuries. That is literally where all like the middle class wealth came from that like just appeared in the last century, by the way. And shit, that it used to all be just feudalism. It was the one guy who owned the whole country and would lease it to other guys and their families. And 99% of the population were just serfs. Later in American history, you had company towns, where workers were geographically and legally isolated from the rest of the country, paid shite wages, which they then had to repay to the company for access to overpriced goods, services, and rent. Yet Irish, Jewish, Italian migrants coming over from Europe fleeing famine and war and poverty, and they were exploited. Their labor was stolen from them. Shit, even to this day, wage theft happens. And of course it happens disproportionately to minorities, but it happens to plenty of white people as well. Which, by the way, wage theft is when your boss just doesn't pay you for the time you worked, even though legally your boss has to pay you that. Just doesn't do it. Over 30% of the wages in the United States that should be paid out just aren't. It just doesn't happen. That's like almost a third of them. Because what are you gonna do? Sue your boss? With what money are you going to afford a lawyer? Watch as your boss finds a bullshit reason to just fire you, blacklist you from the industry, and then bury you in lawsuits of their own until you put a fucking bullet through your head. How are you gonna afford getting that fixed without health insurance? So white people, especially the poor ones, right? When you see black people, Asian people, Native Americans, whatever other ethnicities that you see, demanding reparations, acting like something was stolen from them, you're not the person who has to foot that bill. They don't want you to be the person who has to foot that bill, because you clearly have not benefited from their exploitation. But the people they're actually targeting, they benefited from the exploitation of your ancestors as well. These are your allies. You should be teaming up with them and taking the fight to the people who are currently manipulating you, pitting you against each other. You, like all of those non-white people, all of those minorities that were exploited cruelly by powerful, wealthy taskmasters so they could afford bigger palaces, you deserve reparations as well. Yes, of course, more labor was stolen from minorities, there was more cruelty, there were more systems to, keep them back after the fact. Fewer reparations have been made because of the color of their skin. The nice thing is, when you do reparations, you do not have to distribute them by the color of people's skin. You can focus on distributing them by poverty, because that way, just always the right people are going to get the right amount of reparations. And yes, sure, 100%, whatever, way that ultimately, if this ever happens, the repayment of reparations will be implemented, it's going to be flawed. It's not going to be perfect. There's going to be some people who get some of that money and investment and wealth that don't really need or deserve it. But if you see a plan, a scheme, a policy, right, that would help an immense amount of people in an immense amount of need, and then you also see that that scheme is imperfect, as things in reality usually are, especially if they are undertakings of this level of complexity, and you think to yourself, oh, I think that the very small sliver of people that's gonna get a little bit of something, even though they're not the main intended target audience, I'm just gonna tank this whole fucking scheme and deprive all of those massive amounts of people of what they need. Your priorities are wrong. I'm not even asking you to re-examine them, you're just wrong. That's a level of derangement on par with stopping the fire brigade from putting out a house that is burning and where there's children screaming as their flesh is fucking consumed by flames because, oh, maybe a little bit of the water from the fire hose is gonna land on the candles of the neighboring house that's not on fire. This is how insane this line of thinking is. But for any of this to happen at all of these atomized factions need to start showing solidarity for one another once again. You're all in the same fight, and the people who are telling you that there's not enough money to go around are lying. I mean, of course they are, they think that's their money and they have a ton of it, but it isn't really their money. And yeah, sure, people who were born rich, they didn't choose to be born rich either. There's even some who want to be taxed more because they understand that all of these charity organizations are basically just PR firms for the existence of billionaires. And if the rich were properly taxed, they'd still be rich. But plenty of rich people, they're not even rich because of their ancestors stole labor. They are very, very, very extremely rich because they chose to do deeply unethical shit. They chose to steal labor today. That's money that they stole from you, not their ancestors from your ancestors. So this is barely even about millionaires, this is about billionaires. Putting this into perspective for a second, 1,000,000 seconds, right? That's 13 days. And 1,000,000,000 seconds is 31 years. And those billionaires, they're not paying taxes properly. Most of them don't pay any tax at all. And they sure as shit didn't earn that money. What do you think, Jeff Bezos worked millions of more hours than you do? I mean, ultimately, the way to do this that would be best for the economy and would really just create a lot of very stable and productive businesses, provided good for the economy to you means that, all people can participate in the economy and be compensated fairly for doing honest work, would be if corporations were owned by the people who work at those corporations. Because in many ways, you make a corporation more money than they pay you. Otherwise, obviously, they wouldn't pay you. But then your boss, or people who don't even work at the company, they make a lot of money off of your labor that they didn't contribute to. That was you. You did that work. And the only reason they had that money is because they had more privileges earlier than you did. they were born into more wealth. Think about wherever it is you work, and consider whether your boss is actually particularly competent at what they do. Whether the decisions that corporate makes are good for you, your co-workers, or even the company at large. You may well know someone who could do the job better, maybe even you yourself. Wouldn't it be nice if you actually were involved in those decisions? Wouldn't it be nice if you actually made the money you add to the economy? This type of business exists. It's somewhat uncommon, but it is very stable, very good for the people who work there, very good for the economy in verifiable ways. It is called a worker-owned cooperative. I have a video on this as well, although I have to warn you, it's pre-beard era burger. So that would ultimately make more people have more money. And depending on how far you want to stretch the concept of reparations, this is exactly what you'll get. Or who knows, maybe the reason for all that is that, like, concepts ultimately are not entirely separate ever in any case or situation, and they have a lot of overlap, especially when they're very closely related. But what do I know? I'm just a guy on the internet. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. I am still working on fixing the merchandise shelf. There have been issues with it over a year now. And in that spirit, I hate talking about politics. I hate it so much. I don't really enjoy doing this kind of thing very much anymore. I mean, I don't know if I ever did, but I do it because I feel driven to do it, but it takes a lot out of me every single time because everyone is just so fucking focused on drama and being vicious and being a cunt. And not in a good way. And I don't like it. I just don't like it. And see you around, cunts, but in a good way.